Hey, greetings, friends, and welcome to week 4. This is going to be lecture 2, and we're going to kind of pick up where we left off. We were talking about the necessity for being clear in shared expressions, defining what we mean so that in the clarity of our conversations, we're able to pass down, disseminate very clear statements about who we are, what we do, why we do what we do, and what we value. And one of the things that I challenged you on the last lecture is to not see this as an attempt to be clever, but to see this as in some ways to be contextually clear. So whatever works within the context of your congregational and communal setting is what I'm going to prefer for you. And so I'm just going to share a few ideas, kind of thoughts that I have regarding what we do and why we did what we did in terms of the work we did in Pekin and beyond that. So the first thing I would say is that one of the areas you have to be clear about is your mission, vision, and values. You've got to be able to name those clearly, consistently, concisely, and repeat them. Say them over and over and over again. When I was at my last church in Pekin, Illinois, every time we did our announcements, we started the same way. Welcome to Bridgeway Church. Welcome to Bridgeway Community Church of the Nazarene, where we exist to connect people to Jesus Christ, each other, and God's purposes for their lives. And we do so through a number of different ways. And we say that every time we gathered, we reiterated our mission, our vision, and values. We worked them into our sermons. We clarified them because we wanted people to understand very clearly who we were, who we are, and why we do what we do. We developed what we called the 3-3-4-5-5. That was very contextual to us. It was the 3 elements of our mission. It was the 3 metrics that we had. It was the 4 pieces of our strategy. It was the 5 things and 5 things we did only. And then it was also the 5 elements of our multiplication leadership culture. And so those 3-3-4-5-5, within the context of our leadership team, we memorized what each of those numbers stood for, and we constantly and consistently talked about them. We gave people in our congregation hooks and handles, which I think were vital for our congregation to be able to walk away with a sense of shared expression. So you would often hear me say things like the least, the last, the lost, the wounded, the weary, and the broken and the battered. That's who God was calling us to as a congregation. And so we would say those things often until they were taken up into the very language and the ethos of our congregation. We developed a term that made sense to us in the time, which was the term hopetimist. Those who believe that though the world is not as it should be, God is busy at work making it as it ought to be. Hopetimist was a contextually relevant concept for us because we lived in a community where hope was absent, and we wanted to make sure that we saw ourselves as agents of hope and reconciliation. I would often joke with them about being good for nothings, that church people are those who do a lot of good for nothing. And so we would constantly joke about being good for nothings. We considered ourselves as the church for misfits. And so at first that was kind of a pejorative term assigned to our church. Well, we took it up as a badge of honor, and we would talk about it often. In fact, I would often hear about that as people would move out and throughout the community. They would say things like, "Oh, you go to Bridgeway Community Church, that's the church for misfits, right?" And our folks would be like, "Yes, that's who we are," because we believed and adopted that and embraced that for ourselves. I preached a sermon in which I talked about chaos theory and how the butterfly flap of the little wings can create a tornado in Texas. And I said, that's kind of what the mustard seed is all about, this idea that something small grows big and has big implications. And I talked about the butterfly flappers in our congregation, those who did seemingly small things, and it created these huge outcomes that they could have never imagined. And that was taken up into the ethos of our church, where somebody would do something good for someone and they would say, "You're out there flapping your butterfly wings." And there's little shared expressions that we would establish throughout the way that would help people identify, determine, and clarify who we are, what we do, and why we do what we do. And I would encourage you, as you begin to think about your own context, to clarify some of those expressions. Again, these aren't vocabulary lists that we hand out, but instead there's something that we say consistently and creatively until it's taken up into the very life of the congregation. The next element of our clarity is the stories we tell. And one of the things I want to encourage you to do is I want you to pay attention to the necessity of curating stories. Curating stories, how we manage stories in our midst. So, and it's really two essences here. One is about being a storyteller, and the other one is about being a story listener. Let's start with a story listener. I think we have to realize that stories indicate the treasured and painful stories of an organization. Many times we go into a congregation and we jump into work without listening or attuning ourselves or being attentive to the stories that people are communicating about who they are, how they understood themselves, what they've gone through, what they've endured, the hardships that they've navigated, and how that shapes a congregational's approach to stability and change. Stories reveal webs of relationship. When you begin to listen well to the way in which people tell stories, you begin to see the connection point between people in the community and people within the congregation. Stories reveal the treasured practices and the rituals of a congregation. There's things that we call sacred cows that have deep and significant meaning within the life of our congregation, but unless we've allowed people the space to share those stories of why those practices and rituals matter, we won't understand why the change of those things or the adaptation of those things might create some of the waves. Now, we may have to help them restory those things or to celebrate those stories as a piece of our past, but not something we're carrying on in the future. But we at least have to understand the motivating factors for those stories. Stories reveal what a people in a place really believes about itself. When you listen to a story of a community, so not just beyond the church, but the community that you're a part of, each community has within it stories that they tell about who we are and how we see ourselves in the world. I pastored in a very broken community for about 5 years, and in the midst of that, they had adopted a kind of story about themselves that I didn't feel was necessarily fair. And so we tried to talk about the importance of retelling our stories or reframing our stories in different ways. Stories reveal what is valued by an organization. I come to realize the intrinsic values within a congregation by the very nature of the stories that they tell. Become a story listener, an insatiably curious person about the people, about the organization, and about the community that you're in. But not only can you be a story listener, you've also got to be a storyteller. Enlist stories to exemplify the mission, vision, and values of your organization. So as you begin to live those things out, as people begin to embrace that, tell stories that reiterate this is who we are, why we do what we do. And that builds a sense of lore within the context of your congregations. Enlist stories that demonstrate the valued behaviors as you begin to see people do the very things that you're calling them to do. Name those things and tell those stories. I don't care if it's on social media. I don't care if you blow people up from time to time. I don't care if you do it through a sermon. I don't care if you do it at board meetings, but make sure that you continue to tell the stories of the valued behaviors within your organization. Celebrate stories that reflect the metrics that you're using in an organization. So for us, we often talked about our metrics were gospel saturation, local community transformation, and multiplication, both micro and macro. Now, those are the metrics that we measure. Those are those things that we said, we're going to measure these things, they're going to count. I wouldn't get up on a Sunday morning and tell our people the number of people that had been there the last week, even if it was a record number, because that wasn't the metrics we were paying attention to. I would get up and tell the story of someone who had surrendered their life to Jesus or had become a faithful disciple. I would tell those kind of stories, the impact that we had in the community. I would tell those stories. Make sure your metrics and the stories that you tell and celebrate match one another. Utilize stories that to fuel, and that's supposed to be fuel the faithful imagination of the people of God. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And then create the lore that will carry your culture forward. As you begin to tell stories, those stories are taken up and retold until they become a part of your congregational ethos, and it helps move you forward into the vision, into the mission, and into the purpose for which God intends for your congregation. Become a storyteller, compellingly deflective. And what I mean by that is get the light off yourself. Don't keep telling stories about the good that you're doing as a leader. Tell the stories about what your people doing as those who have taken to the mission and given themselves to it. I want to talk to us in this next lecture about fueling the missional imagination. And there's a great quote here about from Tara Beth Leach, who says the church does not suffer from a lack of missional opportunities. The church lacks a missional imagination. And that's what I want to take up in our next lecture.